Okay, so this morning we're starting off talking about tenzo. As we saw last night,
Recording in progress.
Tenzo was one of the officers in the Rokuchiji, or the six temple stewards. So tenzo, when we look at the word, when we look at the kanji, literally means in charge of seating. And you would think that's not what we expect for something that we're calling the head cook. So the ten part is in charge of, and the zo part is seating. So why is this kind of in charge of seating? Well, we don't know why, but originally, it's likely because originally this was a job that covered making sure people had seats, making sure people had robes, making sure people had food, all the sort of daily provisions. This job made sure there were flowers and incense and offerings for the altar, really, managing supplies, in some cases finances, and that included overseeing the kitchen. So at some point, this job pivoted and it focused now entirely on the kitchen. So we can see the relationship there with managing resources. Tenzo is always a job about managing resources. Now, somehow over time, it's very specifically focusing on kitchen resources. So as tenzos, we can take our leadership attitude, if you will, and not just tenzos, but it tends to get put under tenzo. The phrase Nichijo Sahanji, which is on your sheet. Nichijo Sahanji is the everyday affair of tea and meals. So this is, yes, tea and meals are simple, everyday, ordinary, daily stuff, not exotic, and also, right? This is a huge dharma gate for us. This is a huge practice. So, we cook and eat every day. We don't always consider that a practice, but in order to live, we have to eat. And in order to eat, we have to take in the lives of plants and animals. So, this very quickly becomes something which is much larger than, just putting rice in the bowl. One of the main points of Dogen's Tenzo Kyokan is preparing meals is the activity of a Buddha. It's an important opportunity for sort of, developing our practice. So we really enter into that space, enter into that activity with a deep understanding that this is practice. This is not just volunteer work. This is not just making the wheels kind of turn, right? There's a real Dharma gate opportunity for us. So when it's our turn to prepare meals for the Sangha, if Sawyer has assigned us to work in the kitchen, we're not going to take that simply as a work assignment, sort of a volunteer job or a mundane sort of work assignment. We're not going to resent the time off the cushion, or the time out of the zendo, or the time, where we would like to think we ought to be doing something else. We need to understand that cooking and zazen are not two different things. So both of them require paying attention to what we're doing, and also paying attention to the effect we're having on other people. So it's just as true of cooking in the kitchen as it is of sitting zazen here. If we're sitting zazen and we're making noise, or we're sitting zazen and we're taking, somebody else's cushion, or, whatever's going on, simply sitting zazen, we know, is not just about us. We're sitting with all beings. We're sitting with people in the room. Cooking, we need to take that same kind of attitude. What we're doing is not just about us. There's something there going on for all beings. So Dogen says, if we're doing this job, this tenzo job, without really understanding what it means, we're doing a lot of hard work and we're wasting an opportunity. So somehow we're working too hard, or we're maybe focusing on the wrong things, and we're also really losing an opportunity to take this on as a real practice, as a deep practice or a dharma gate. So of course it's true in the kitchen, it's just as true for all of our other activities. So yesterday we were started a conversation about, in essence, taking practice off the cushion or taking practice out of the temple. How do we carry that attitude? How do we carry our practice into the rest of our lives? And here's where it starts, right? What we're doing affects all beings other than ourselves. And we have a real opportunity, no matter what the activity is, to really take it on as a dharma gate. So there isn't a difference ultimately between washing the car and sitting zazen, right? So if we're wholeheartedly preparing meals for people, it doesn't matter whether those ingredients are fancy or not fancy. We're really transmitting something. We're transmitting care, we're transmitting hospitality, we're transmitting support for practice, whatever it is that we're working with. In a minute, we'll see why that does matter, but ultimately, Dogen says if we're preparing fancy soup with cream, that's, not different than preparing plain greens, field greens. So, there's an overarching attitude. We need to not be disappointed with what we're given or thinking we can't make a good meal out of what we have. When I was at Toshoji, there were a lot of Westerners there at the time. There was one lady, older lady, who was assigned to be the tenzo, and she walked into the kitchen and she looked around and she came right back out again and said, I can't make a meal out of what's in there. Now at the time, Toshoji had been abandoned for 20 years before I got there. It was just sort of coming back to life as a training temple. It was the poorest temple in the Soto Shu system. I mean, Roshi came one day, we were sitting at the tables, and he said, I've just got the list of all the temples, and we're at the bottom because we just started up again. So this lady walked into the kitchen and walked right back out, and she said, I can't make a meal. She was perplexed. I can't make a meal out of what's in there because there's just nothing. And I didn't have the power to remove her from that assignment, but I removed her from that assignment. I said, stand down, I'll go do it. What was in there was potatoes and cabbage and a few small things. And I took one look at that and said, potato soup, coleslaw, some kind of third bowl. I mean, and it wasn't cream potato soup, it wasn't fancy cheese potato soup, but potato soup. So I went in there and I came back out and I said, here's the meal. And she said, how did you do that? I could never have done that. And I thought, it wasn't that hard. So, I don't want to be snarky about her, but it was a real opportunity for me to see this in action. No matter what we have, coarse greens, it doesn't matter. We can go in there and with some care, we can feed people in some kind of nutritious and relatively appealing way. So no matter what we're working with, food needs to be nutritious. It needs to be appealing. It doesn't need to be fancy. So there's something about tenzo work, I think, that really engages our egos. We really want to make, guilty as charged, really want to make very appealing, very fancy, very impressive food. When I was first learning to be a tenzo in this country, I was up the night before until 2 a.m, chopping, prepping, making all this fancy stuff. You very quickly learn that's not sustainable. It's also not necessary. When we get to the aromatics, I'll tell you another story about that. So, at the same time that we are not clinging to ingredients, we also need to remember the people who are eating need wholesome and somewhat appealing food. And partly what we're doing as tenzos in a leadership position is helping them to cultivate gratitude for interconnectedness, for the work of all the people that was necessary for that meal to happen, right? That's a basic teaching for us. And what the tenzo is doing is really putting that on the ground. We talk about that all the time, right? We talk about gratitude an awful lot, and we talk about interconnectedness and how we should feel about that. But, the work of the tenzo is really giving us something concrete to practice with. If we're not in Sanshin and we're doing meal chants, we get to actually say some of those things, and it gets into the body, and we show some gratitude for this food that's in front of us. But, if we're at home and we're grabbing a sandwich on the way to something else, it's hard to keep that attitude. We just think I need to get food in my body, because the important thing is what I'm going to do, right? When we eat meals in a practice context or with a mind of practice, we actually see what's in front of us, and we get to cultivate some gratitude for that. So the work of the tenzo allows everybody to enter into that space and to cultivate some gratitude. Because what you're doing is not just giving people what they want on a whim. There's a whole thing about, we eat what's served, we accept what comes our way. Without the work of the tenzo and without some leadership on the part of the tenzo, that doesn't work, right? It doesn't happen. Okay, so that's some broad positioning around what tenzo leadership is, where it's headed, what we're really doing, right? So practical areas of tenzo responsibility, and I think you have this on your reference sheet. So tenzo plans the menu. Tenzo manages getting the ingredients. So if the tenzo isn't actually buying them, there's management there. Tenzo is overseeing all the other people working in the kitchen. So in a larger place, you often have at least one person, in North America, you often have at least one person in the kitchen helping, prepping, chopping, right? Sometimes that person comes in during the last zazen period of Sanshin and just helps the tenzo finish the meal. So you are directly supervising other people's work practice. You are also overseeing serving and cleanup. And in a minute, we'll talk about, sort of the considerations about serving, but also how are we managing the cleanup in the kitchen? How are we treating our artifacts? Are we being wholehearted? Are we taking care of cleanliness? All of those things are part of this universe of tenzo, right? Okay, so that's the practical stuff, but when it comes to modeling practice, again, what are we doing? So now, very much about using temple resources with some care. This is a stewardship position in that way. The food that you're serving either was donated or was bought with money that was donated. So we have to be really careful about managing resources. And when we get to not wasting things, it's part of that conversation. So being resourceful, how do we make the best use of what we have? How do we reuse things that are left over? Are we managing that meal in an efficient way, using the right tools, moving things through efficiently? How are we serving others, and how do we understand what that means to serve others? Not only are we literally serving food, how are we coming to whatever we're doing with the mind that says there's other beings in this besides me, not being self-involved. And finally, paying attention to practice in daily life. Again, we're cooking and eating every day. This is not an exotic activity for us, and yet, how are we sort of treating our everyday lives as practice?